What is your name? What faculty do you teach in? And how long have you been teaching at Douglas?
So my name is Nathan Hall, and I am in the faculty of LLPA. I teach in 3 different departments. I teach in ELA, which is the English Language Learning and Acquisition. I teach in Student Success, and I also teach in the TESL training program. So that's teaching new ESL teachers. And I am also the Educational Technology and Pedagogy Coordinator for LLPA. I've been at the college since January 2014.
Wonderful. Could you tell us what are OERs?
So OER stands for Open Educational Resources, but what does that really mean? If you unpack it, it means a lot of different types of things to different people. So a lot of people think first off of open textbooks. So those are free textbooks that can be viewed online. You can get them in either cheap or free print type versions, but OER is much more than that. It means also things like videos, interactive elements. It can even be syllabi, so you can actually have a syllabus and it can be open ed resource that people share out, often using the Creative Commons licenses. So there's different various licenses in the Creative Commons, but it's this idea of taking what we have and instead of keeping it for ourselves, we share it with others, and then others can then build off of that using the different licenses to remix, rebuild, adapt to their own situations.
Perfect. So why have you decided to use OERs in your own classes?
First off, the principle of OERs fits me really well because I'm all about working in collaboration and consultation with other people, including my students. And so I don't like to say that I own the materials I have. I'm the kind of the curator of those, and then I can share those out with other people. So that's kind of been my ethos for a long time. And then so when I came across OER as this kind of community, if you want to call it like that, I discovered that there was a lot of really good material out there that I could just take, almost like in bare bones type of format, and then adapt it to my situation. So in a current class, I might have students reading chapters from multiple textbooks instead of having to choose one textbook which kind of fits most of it and having students pay really expensive fees. This gave me the chance for students to be able to have the flexibility of seeing different viewpoints and different perspectives, and I can adapt it so that it can actually fit more localized. So I can even make it down to New Westminster if I wanted to be, instead of having to do that. And lastly, one of the things that happens with textbook manufacturers, publishers, is that they often try to avoid really delicate type of topics, which really shouldn't be delicate topics. They should be just openly discussed anyway. And so you'll find that minority groups, underrepresented groups, things like that don't often appear in textbooks. And so you can actually take that and you can add that to your own material. So you can take examples that were in an OER textbook, and then you can add things like, for example, what do we mean by when we're talking about this particular minority group and how they're working with this type of thing. So we can have those discussions in the classroom instead of avoiding them. So for me, the philosophy of OER has been something that I really wanted to build off and embrace, and have other people realize the flexibility it gives you, and still it gives you the quality and the depth that you want from an actual resource that you bring into your class from traditional means.
Do you feel that OERs you've used are different quality from traditional course material?
Obviously, because it's a mix, I have to sift through materials and find stuff that is really high quality. Sometimes I find stuff that is really low quality, but I wouldn't say that that's any different than any other publishing. Like, I get textbooks all the time where there's glaring mistakes in it or huge holes in what they're trying to present. And so you always have to work around those things by adding your own things to them. Well, with OER, you just don't use that part. You use what is helpful to you. So like I said, I have one class where I have multiple textbooks, and I have students be able to hit the things that are strengths in one book, but it might be a weakness in that book. Well, then I just grab it from this one. And so it's not about saying like OER is higher quality or lower quality or anything. It's just like anything else. There's a mix, and you do have to be a little bit more discerning and regards to that because there's a lot more out there. But I don't say that it's lower quality or higher quality because of that. So.
Now, have students ever complained about OERs?
No, which is, I'm not saying that students wouldn't, but in my particular class, they've actually said the opposite. So an example of that for me is instead of using a PDF copy of an OER textbook or a bound version of a textbook, I'm using a web version, so an HTML version. So that would mean that what it means for my students is that they can actually just take out their phones and they can go directly. I can have a link directly to that section of the textbook instead of having to say go to chapter 6. I have a link to chapter 6. And then that way they can view it on their phones, they can do it while they're on the bus, going to work, coming back from work. They can do it during free time. I know that students' time is really compressed. There's not a lot of time for them to be able to do stuff. So anytime I can do something for them that helps them be able to make the most of their time, I find I get a lot more response back from that. And that's what I've heard from my students. So in my evaluations, post-class evaluations I do with my students, that's the one thing that keeps coming up over and over again is thank you for using this open textbook because I didn't want to have to pay for an expensive textbook. I was able to do this on my own time, and the flexibility was that I didn't have to be in front of a laptop or a desktop. I could do it on the bus. So.
How do you think other faculty can start implementing OERs?
One of the things I would say is start talking with the library here first off. We have an exceptional team here at the library in regards to open educational resources. Talk to them first. They have curated specific examples of OER resources for each of the faculties and departments within Douglas College. So you don't even have to go exploring on your own. You can just go to someone and ask them. So Deborah Flowing at the library, you can talk with her and she'll happily take you through a number of the resources that are available. But another thing is BC Campus. We have an excellent resource through BC Campus website. They have a whole list of curated and searchable OER textbooks and resources. And so I would just say start that conversation with the library, do a little bit of research on your own, and talk to other people in your faculty or department that have been using resources and ask them, what is it that you do with it? How does this work? And ask those questions like, what is the quality like? And finding out from them what they're doing. So that's what I would suggest.
Would you recommend the implementation of OERs to other faculty?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, hands down. I mean, it's not that there's always going to be an OER resource available. For example, in our TESL training program, I have not been able to find an OER resource that fits what I'm looking for. There are bits and pieces. So OER, because it also means those interactive elements and stuff, I can find different pieces, but I can't find a big chunk like an OER textbook that would fit. And so in some situations it's not going to work. But you can still find and supplement what you're doing with OER resources, like these open ed resources. And you can start building your own too. So that's the other thing I do is I license out all of my resources that I make in my class as Creative Commons so that then it can be part of the OER library and other people can use it. So that's what I would suggest.
Can you please introduce yourself? Just tell us your name, your faculty, and how many years you've been a professor at Douglas.
So I'm Jennifer Barker. I'm in the Department of Biology. I teach mostly first year anatomy and physiology. I've been at Douglas for about 7 years now. Not quite 10 yet, but close.
Great. So what are OERs?
So OERs are open educational resources, meaning they're openly accessible basically to everyone. They're not necessarily free, but they're typically provided free to students so that anyone who has access to the internet or can be given access to the internet, for example, can have access to them, or they're provided by instructors in classrooms in sort of a physical form.
Sounds good. So why have you decided to use OERs in your classes?
I decided to use OERs in my classrooms because I had an awful large number of students who wouldn't otherwise have any resources. So I had students showing up to class who had not purchased a textbook. Our textbooks are quite expensive in biology. They're often large doorstop like tomes. So students often choose not to purchase them, knowing full well that, for example, they're not going to use the entire textbook anyway. We only test them on part, for example, of a 1,500 page book in a given course. So it's a bit of an investment that may not be worth it to our students. I would rather provide my students with a minimalist type of resource that they all have access to than ask them to search the internet for things, or to go, and try to borrow a copy from the library for an hour at a time, or other alternatives that some students have come up with. So what clinched it for me was that I had students who were trying to do things like memorize Wikipedia pages, getting accused of cheating, because we know when you've copied a Wikipedia page, right? Well, you must have done that with your phone in your lap or something. And no, they were actually quite good students in that they could memorize almost an entire Wikipedia page, but that's not the purpose of the course. So to try to move away from that, I want to be able to give my students something that if you want to memorize something, memorize this, and repeat this back to me, and I will be a happy instructor.
Perfect. Do you feel OERs you have used are different quality from the traditional course material?
I do, actually. So the resources that we've been providing so far to our students are what I would say fun. I would classify them as fine. They are usable. They're not super great. I cannot, I can't sugarcoat this too much. We are not, the people who design, develop, create, and adapt these resources are not professional editors, illustrators, authors in a lot of cases. So, we're doing our best with what we can. That being said, a lot of the really slick side of things, so the really pretty diagrams, the really nice, colorful, modern-looking formats and things that are provided by professionally developed textbooks aren't really necessary. I mean, we've found over the last year and a half in particular, students are very forgiving. If we can provide the information in a consistent way and in a meaningful way, the actual aesthetic quality of it doesn't matter as much as the content. And I mean, it's comforting for instructors to know that, because I would rather my students be learning the content than being distracted by the pretty pictures, as much as I like them to look at diagrams. So we are working on adapting our resources in particular, improving the diagrams, improving the layout, improving the language that's used in terms of consistency across different chapters and these sorts of things. It is a long-term project, and so maybe someday, right, they will be on par with commercial textbooks. But in the meantime, in terms of their value for educating students and their utility to students, they are on par, if not better, than the commercial textbooks, because they're specifically designed for our classes and our students.
Got it. All right, have your students ever complained about OERs?
I have not had any students complain about the OERs that I've provided. All of the resources that I've provided my students, including both ones that we've created or adapted in-house, as well as those that are external, so external videos and things like this that are produced but freely accessible by other people, have been fine, like I say, so they've been usable. My students do definitely appreciate that things have been pared down, so that they're not trying to find information in a giant tome. The only complaint that I've gotten realistically from any of my students has been that there are sometimes too many of them and they're not quite sure where to turn. So because I do like to provide my students with a number of different options for, like, if you don't want to listen to me lecture about this particular topic, here's a crash course video, or here's a Khan Academy type of video. They sometimes feel a little bit overwhelmed until, we sit down and realize that, okay, no, just take a quick look through them, see which style you like best, and then you can just stay with that and fine. The textbook I've gotten no complaints about, I suspect in part because students do give us some slack for the fact that it's free, or at least freely accessible. So, and I also do encourage them to give me feedback on the textbook. So any critiques about format, font size, things like that, down to typos or poor phrasing of things. I like to think that the students appreciate that when they tell me that sort of information, I can actually fix it on the spot, which is a nice part of the adaptability of OERs, is that I can actually fix problems pretty much immediately.
Nice. How can other faculties start implementing OERs?
Just do it. So I initially got introduced to OERs when Jaime from KPU came and talked to us, and I was really taken by the fact that it was a textbook that we could edit. At the time, I took a stab at it, and it was horrific. The interface that was available for the textbook that I wanted was not at all. It was accessible to students. You could read the textbook just fine. But the back end, in terms of having to edit it, was not at all accessible. Currently here in BC, BC Campus has set up a WordPress style site for us to use to edit the textbooks in, and they're all available in that type of format. But we've got instructors here that are making their own in-course textbooks in, Microsoft Word. Anything that you can convert to a PDF. Some of them are getting a little bit fancier, right, and using, Publisher, for example. But a lot of textbooks are already available, so if there's one that's already accessible, that's the easiest thing to do, is just to grab one and just throw it down in front of your students and say, here you go, let's try this. I do think it's important to let students know what's going on when you do that. So you do need to tell them that, this is an open educational resource, it's freely accessible to you. I realize it's probably not perfect. We can fix it, right? We can work together to make this better for everybody. And again, students are generally forgiving, and all of the textbooks that are out there have the vast majority of the information that we want our students to have. So they're all usable.
Great.
Don't be shy.
So would you recommend the implementation of OERs to other faculty?
I would. In particular for any faculty that are teaching courses where a textbook is required for content. So I know a lot of the sciences, for example, right, have realistically the content of our science textbooks has not changed dramatically over the last 100 years or so. Some of the more advanced things, so some of the more up-to-date computer textbooks, for example, or things like biochemistry, molecular things that we've gotten a bit better at seeing have added stuff for sure. But there's not a lot of basic content in particular that is not findable somewhere, right, in some sort of accessible form. So I think it's probably beneficial to most faculty, if you have the option, to be able to allow your students access to the resources that you want them to have without additional cost to them, right? Without additional barriers. We don't need any more barriers put up in front of students. Right? Things are bad enough. So, and like I say, I mean, at least in my courses, if you've got a textbook that costs $10, maybe it's not a big deal. But if you've got if you're in the sciences or in a specialty field where the textbooks are $200 or $300, or I know in some of the business cases they're more than that. If you do have the option, it's worth it just to make sure that your students all have the information that they need.
Could you tell us your name, what faculty you teach in, and how many years have you been teaching at Douglas?
So my name is Jaime Yard, and I teach in the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences in the Department of Anthropology, and this is my 8th year at Douglas College.
Could you tell us what are OERs?
So open educational resources are books and texts with Creative Commons licenses on them, meaning that you can use them for free, you can reproduce them for free, adapt them for free for your own purposes in your classes.
Why have you decided to use OERs in your classes?
So one of the main courses I teach here at Douglas College is Intro to Anthropology, and this is typically a course that I would say like 95% of the students in there are there as an elective, and it may be the only course they ever take in anthropology. So for me, it's pretty hard to justify a textbook that might cost anywhere between $80 and $200, which is pretty standard for introductory texts in anthropology. For a long time, I sought out texts that were on the lower end of the price market, but when an OER became available, produced by the American Anthropological Association, I jumped on it because I wanted students to have accessible educational resources.
Sweet. Do you feel OERs you've used are different quality from traditional course material?
So the OERs I've only actually used one OER, and I find it of comparable quality to the glossy textbooks that are developed. It was developed with oversight from the American Anthropological Association and was edited by a number of, by 3 anthropologists, I believe, and they reached out to have experts in each of the subfields that comprise the chapters to write those chapters. So I think it's of comparable quality. And I really like the fact that if I want to edit it, I can do that.
Have students ever complained about OERs?
No, I've never had a complaint.
How can other faculties start implementing OERs?
I think we live in a really exciting time in terms of the amount of resources that are available online for instruction. So of course it takes some time to curate those resources and put them together for a course, but I think faculty can start just by finding out what's out there. There's great lists on the BC CAT website of different OERs that are out there, and there's certainly other websites that collect them.
Perfect. Would you recommend the implementation of OERs to other faculty?
I have and I do.
Welcome, David. Please introduce yourself to us. Can you tell us your name, the faculty you're in, and how many years you've been at Douglas for?
My name is David Wright. I'm currently the chair of English, but I'm also an instructor of English. Most students here encounter me through courses about academic writing.
Nice, thank you. And how long have you been at Douglas for?
I have been at Douglas for 13 years, which seems like a long time, but it's felt like a long time.
All right, perfect. Let's dive into OER. So why did you decide to use OERs in your courses?
I decided to do an OER, which stands for Open Educational Resources, mostly because in English particularly, we use a lot of texts that are open source in the sense that they're no longer under copyright. And so students were having to buy textbooks, which can cost anywhere up to $100, with things that were pretty readily available on the internet. And so I wanted to save students money because I don't want them spending all that cash on textbooks and other things. I'd rather they spend it on living allowances.
Sounds good. Can you dive deeper into what OERs are?
Sorry, you gotta say that again.
Can you tell us a bit more about what OERs are?
Okay. So what OER what?
What
I
is-
only have them written down. I don't want to rip
Yes.
up my phone.
What are OERs?
Okay, what are they? Okay, great. OERs are mostly materials that are available online. In other words, they're not under copyright. They're also materials that can be remixed, and so some of you who are a little older will remember things like rip, mix, and burn, which means that you can adapt the materials, you can reuse the materials, you can repackage the materials. So a lot of OER means that there's a couple of really big benefits to them. One of them is that they're pretty up to date. So unlike a textbook gets published and then goes out, and then there could be years between the material and when we actually encounter that material. With OER, stuff's constantly being updated, and often it's being augmented constantly. So you can use other things like test banks that are newer and more adaptable, and you can also use materials that have been updated by experts in the field really recently. And so that can really help students' engagement, and it means that hopefully you're not reading examples from the 1960s when you're trying to apply materials, but you're getting examples from the current cultural climate.
Thank you. Do you feel OERs you have used are different quality from the traditional course material available?
Yeah, the question of quality around OERs is a really common one, and I think that what's really important to remember about OERs is the quality is often better. So the quality of OERs is often more current, more more readily audited or edited by professionals in the field. And because of that, a lot of the times open educational resources are more current, better, and then cheaper too than traditional textbooks.
Perfect. Have your students ever complained about OERs?
Students have never complained about OER, ever. The only thing that OER and something that students might want to be aware of is that sometimes instructors are not great at saying, hey, there's this OER resource, and then you find yourself having to navigate online context, so you have to read it on your, Amazon Kindle or your computer or otherwise. And one thing to remember is that you can always print out OER if you have a textbook, and that's how you work, and you like to underline things with highlighters. You can do that. I know the bookstore at Douglas College will do that for you on a fee basis, or at least that's how I understand it. And you can also do it if you take it to a print shop. And so you can get yourself a paper copy of it if that's how you like to work. But you can also just use it for free if you don't want to print it. Or you can just print off sections of it. So one of the things I like to remind students who may complain, for instance, about where do I get it or how do I engage with OER, is that like OER itself, you can engage or get it any way you want. You can get it printed, or you can print out parts, or you can save parts, and so on and so forth. So lots of ways to use it. But I've never heard a direct complaint about using OER.
Nice. How can other faculties start implementing OERs?
Well, partly it's doing videos like this and spreading the word. I think that for me, I'm always encouraged when I hear students using OER and encouraging their instructors to adopt OER resources. I know it's really difficult and intimidating to go up to your professor or your instructor and say, hey, you know, this $600 marketing textbook we're using, is there anything that's cheaper and available online? But I think it's well worth doing that, because oftentimes instructors just need a little nudge and they're not aware that those materials are available. So that's one thing, is I try to be a support mechanism for students who want to ask. So if a student comes to me and says, you know, there's this other instructor, I might be able to help by going to that instructor and say, hey, like, do you want to talk about OERs? As well, just to get used to the idea, which most of us are used to in the internet age, that materials that are online and materials that are freely available doesn't mean that they're worse. They're just being delivered in a different way. And if you look into it a little bit more, you find that often, like materials we have at the library, they're frequently updated, they're frequently used, they're frequently adapted, and that can really help with the accuracy of those materials and the relevance for when you go into the working world.
Great. You touched on this a little bit, but would you recommend the implementation of OERs to other faculty?
Yes, I would recommend implementation of OERs everywhere. So, I mean, there are some instances where you'd want to make sure that those OERs were accredited by a professional body. So in areas like nursing or anything where there's life or death potential, you obviously want those OER resources to be sanctioned and to be put together by professionals who understand what's required of those materials and what needs to be there. But beyond that, there really isn't much of an excuse anymore, for example, for me making a student pay upwards of $40 for a copy of Jonathan Swift's text that was written in 1640. We can easily deal with that. It's well out of copyright. And so in particular, one of my responses to that is to remember that it's okay to do a mix. So in some of my courses, for example, I do require that students buy a couple of novels, but then all the other course reading is free. And so I think thinking about adopting OERs doesn't mean everything has to be OER or open, but it might be really helpful for a student, for example, to have only to buy 2 novels that they can get used and so on and so forth, and then not have all the other, what we would call in academic language, tertiary materials also costing them money. So I like to be really clear with my students about what's going to cost them money and what isn't, and make sure that they spend the money where they need to and not where they necessarily